The morning sun poured through the large windows of Meridian Global Solutions' towering office building, casting long shadows across Sarah Johnson's desk. At 32, Sarah had already achieved more than many people did in their entire careers. Despite her success, she carried herself with quiet grace, an aura that made her approachable to everyone in the office. She was not the type to boast, and her reputation had been built on hard work and dedication, not on her family name. Today, however, was especially significant. Sarah had spent the last 3 years balancing full-time work with evening classes, and it had finally paid off. She had just completed her MBA with honors from Columbia Business School. The diploma she had received last weekend sat in her desk drawer, still tucked in its leather holder, untouched by any formal announcement. She hadn't shown it to anyone yet, preferring to let it speak for itself. For Sarah, the accomplishment wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a testament to years of sacrifice and dedication, to hours spent in classrooms after long days at work. As she sat at her desk, adjusting her navy blue blazer and checking her reflection on her phone screen, Sarah made sure her braided hair was still neatly styled. It was a habit she had developed over the years, a small act of self-care and presentation in an environment that often judged her more harshly than her peers. In a corporate world that valued polished appearances, especially for someone like Sarah, who was often one of the few women of color in meetings, looking impeccable had become second nature. Her desk was a reflection of her success and her journey. The golden nameplate in front of her read, Sarah Johnson, Senior Marketing Executive. It was a small yet powerful symbol of how far she had come. The room around her was an organized blend of hard work and achievement. On the walls, framed awards from various marketing competitions hung, reminding her of the milestones she had crossed. A small pot of plants sat next to her dual monitors, a gift from her team after the successful holiday campaign they had executed together the previous year. Despite the accolades and the recognition, Sarah remained humble and focused on her work, her mind set on the task ahead. That morning, her focus was on preparing for the upcoming department meeting. As she opened her laptop to review her presentation, her thoughts drifted back to the campaign that had made her an even bigger asset to the company, the youth education campaign that had exceeded expectations by 200%. It had been Sarah's idea to shift focus to social media platforms, opting to reach young people where they were, rather than relying on traditional advertising channels. The results spoke for themselves, and Sarah was proud of the work her team had done. Before she could dive into her slides, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Hey Sarah, those campaign numbers from last quarter are incredible." Tom from accounting called out as he walked past her desk, nodding in approval. Sarah smiled warmly in return, appreciating the acknowledgement. She had worked long hours to ensure that campaign was a success, but she never took praise for granted. She had earned every piece of recognition that came her way, not because of her name but because of her dedication to her craft. With a quiet smile, Sarah turned her attention back to the presentation she had been perfecting for days. This new strategy, the one she was about to present, was for a sustainable fashion brand, and it combined environmental consciousness with urban appeal, a fusion of two markets she believed were ripe for the taking. The research had been exhaustive, and she had spent many nights staying late at the office to make sure everything was precise. The presentation had to be flawless. This was her opportunity to showcase her abilities, her hard work, and her vision for the company's future. As she sat there reviewing her slides, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on her journey at Meridian Global Solutions. It had all begun 5 years ago, when she had joined the company as a junior marketing associate. Back then she had taken on every project that came her way, eager to learn and to prove herself. While others had complained about the extra work, Sarah had seen each assignment as a stepping stone, an opportunity to grow and make an impact. She had built her career from the ground up, earning each promotion based on merit and dedication. What none of her colleagues knew, however, was that Sarah could have started at the top. As the daughter of David Johnson, the founder and CEO of Meridian Global Solutions, Sarah could have easily walked into an executive role, bypassing the corporate ladder entirely. But that had never been the path she wanted to take. Both she and her father had agreed that earning respect was far more valuable than having it handed to her. Real respect is earned, not given, her father had told her the night before her first day as a junior associate. He had emphasized that Sarah would never use her family name to get ahead in her career, and she had honored that promise, even going so far as to use her mother's maiden name on her MBA application to avoid any special treatment. Despite her father's powerful influence in the company, Sarah had always strived to carve out her own path. Over the years, she had worked hard to build a reputation based on her skills, her intelligence, and her tireless work ethic. Looking around the office now, she felt proud of what she had accomplished on her own. The company's success was something she had played a part in, but it was also her success, a reflection of her abilities, not her name. At 9:45 a.m., the department meeting was set to begin in just 15 minutes. Sarah quickly gathered her materials and headed to the conference room, her mind racing as she prepared for the big presentation. She had heard rumors about an opening for the marketing director position, and the whispers were only adding to her determination to nail this presentation. She had worked too hard to let this opportunity slip away. As Sarah walked down the hallway to the conference room, she noticed a new face in the office. Mark Stevens, a recent hire from a competitor, stood by the water cooler, talking animatedly to a group of colleagues. He was leaning heavily on his past successes, speaking loudly about his previous work and his approach to corporate culture. Sarah had heard some office gossip about him. He was known for his strong opinions, especially when it came to maintaining professional standards and upholding traditional corporate values. She made a mental note to be extra prepared for any questions or challenges Mark might present during the meeting. It was clear he had a no-nonsense attitude, and Sarah knew she needed to be on her toes. When she entered the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. The room was packed with colleagues, all of them seated around the polished wooden table, waiting for her to begin. Sarah's slides were ready, displaying crisp graphics and market analysis for the sustainable fashion campaign. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes of sunlight across the room, highlighting the seriousness of the moment. Sarah took a deep breath and began her presentation. As you can see from these numbers, she said, pointing to the chart on the screen, Gen Z consumers are willing to spend 30% more on sustainable products. She continued, outlining the campaign's goals and the strategy she had developed. But just as she was about to dive deeper into her analysis, she was interrupted. "Excuse me," Mark Stevens' voice cut through her presentation like a knife. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his tone dripping with skepticism. "But don't you think this is a bit unrealistic? I mean, given your background, how would you understand luxury market spending habits?" The room fell silent. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken, but she kept her composure. She had dealt with difficult situations like this before. "Actually, Mr. Stevens," Sarah replied evenly, "these findings are based on 6 months of market research and focus groups, which included both luxury and sustainable fashion consumers." Mark didn't seem convinced. He chuckled and glanced around the room as if sharing an inside joke. "Let me tell you what really works in this industry," he said, standing up and walking to the front of the room without being invited. "Maybe in your community sustainable fashion means something different, but our target demographic," Jennifer Chen, Sarah's direct supervisor, was quick to cut him off. "Mark, Sarah has the floor. Please take your seat." But Mark wasn't finished. He waved his hand dismissively at Sarah's slides. "Look, I'm just trying to maintain our company's standards here. We can't risk our reputation on experimental approaches. Some of us have to work very hard to get where we are. We can't all rely on diversity cores." Several gasps echoed around the room, and Sarah felt the sting of his words. Her cheeks burned, but she didn't let it show. Years of navigating corporate spaces had taught her how to handle moments like this. She straightened her spine, met Mark's gaze, and responded firmly, "Mr. Stevens, if you'd like, I'd be happy to discuss the specifics of our market research after the meeting. But for now, I ask that you let me finish my presentation." The room was still for a moment, and Sarah could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. The atmosphere at Meridian Global Solutions had shifted dramatically since Sarah Johnson's presentation the day before. Sarah had never anticipated that her ordinary workday would turn into a battleground for professionalism and corporate ethics. Mark Stevens, a newly hired middle manager, had made his opinions known in the most disruptive way possible during her presentation. His unprovoked comments, questioning not only the validity of Sarah's market research but also undermining her expertise with condescending remarks about diversity, had left the entire room in an uncomfortable silence. His actions were not just unprofessional, they were discriminatory, a textbook example of corporate bias, and Sarah was determined to ensure that such behavior didn't go unchecked. Though the confrontation had been tense, Sarah had stood her ground with a calm and measured response, refusing to let Mark's dismissal of her work go unnoticed. Jennifer Chen, Sarah's supervisor, had promptly intervened, making it clear that Mark's behavior was unacceptable and instructing him to take a seat. Afterward, as Sarah continued her presentation, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. Some were visibly uncomfortable, others looked angry, and a few were documenting Mark's inappropriate behavior on their phones. It was a small form of silent rebellion against his actions, a sign that they too were disturbed by what had transpired. As the meeting concluded, Mark stormed out of the room muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." He bumped past Sarah as he left, his body language aggressive, a final attempt to assert dominance. But Sarah remained composed, her mind already moving on to the next step in her strategy. It was clear to her now that she would not let this incident slide. She had earned her place in the company, and she was determined to protect that by confronting what had happened head-on. The support from her colleagues started almost immediately after the meeting ended. At her desk, Sarah received messages from Tom in accounting, offering her a cup of her favorite coffee as a gesture of solidarity. Emily from the creative department sent a supportive email, attaching screenshots of Mark's most egregious comments made during the meeting. Even Kevin, the usually quiet intern, stopped by to tell her how much he had learned from her presentation, offering his support in his own way. Despite the harshness of the situation, Sarah found strength in these small acts of kindness from those who recognized the injustice of Mark's behavior. As the day wore on, an email from Jennifer arrived in Sarah's inbox, confirming that an official complaint had been filed with HR. The wheels of accountability had been set in motion, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. What Mark didn't realize, what none of them knew, was that every discriminatory comment he had made, every dismissive gesture, had been witnessed not just by the colleagues in the room but would soon be laid out in a formal complaint that would make its way to the desk of David Johnson, the CEO of Meridian Global Solutions himself. The following day, Sarah walked into the office with a mixture of emotions. There was still a lingering sense of anger from the previous day's events, but it was tempered by a feeling of determination. There was also a glimmer of hope that this incident would serve as a catalyst for the necessary changes the company so desperately needed. As Sarah passed through the office that morning, she couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the air. Colleagues who had once barely acknowledged her now exchanged nods of sympathy and admiration. Her inbox was flooded with supportive messages from those who had witnessed the meeting, along with a few from employees who hadn't been present but had heard about the incident. By the time Sarah arrived at her desk, Jennifer was already there, waiting for her with a look of concern on her face. "Sarah, we need to talk," Jennifer said quietly, motioning for her to follow. They walked to one of the small conference rooms, where they found Maria Torres, the head of human resources, already seated. Maria had a thick folder in front of her, her expression serious as she adjusted her glasses. "First, Sarah, I want you to know that we are taking this very seriously," Maria began, opening the folder to reveal detailed notes. "We've already received 12 separate reports about yesterday's incident. That's unprecedented." Sarah blinked in surprise. She hadn't realized how many people had taken action to document Mark's behavior. Some had spoken to HR directly, others had submitted emails, but the sheer number of reports made it clear that Sarah wasn't alone in feeling the weight of Mark's comments. Maria continued, spreading a series of documents across the table. There were emails, meeting notes, and even screenshots of Mark's previous controversial remarks in company chat groups. Tom from accounting had sent over a recording of the meeting, ensuring there was no way Mark could deny what had happened. Jennifer chimed in, confirming the recording's authenticity. "Like many companies, Meridian records meetings for documentation purposes," she said. "Mark can't deny any of it." The air in the room grew heavier as they discussed the details of the previous day's meeting. Sarah could sense that both Maria and Jennifer were being cautious in their tone, exchanging knowing glances as if they were aware of something they couldn't fully disclose to her yet. "There's more," Jennifer said carefully, choosing her words with precision. 3 other employees have come forward with similar experiences involving Mark. It seems this wasn't an isolated incident. The gravity of the situation settled in Sarah's chest. Mark's behavior wasn't a one-off, it was part of a pattern of misconduct that had likely been allowed to fester unchecked. It only added to the weight of the decision she had made to speak up. The meeting continued for an hour, with Maria taking detailed notes of Sarah's account. As they wrapped up, Maria paused, choosing her words with care. "The executive team will be reviewing this case personally. I can't say more, but I want you to know that changes are coming." There was a resolute tone in Maria's voice that left Sarah feeling more assured that the company was taking this seriously. Throughout the rest of the day, the support continued to pour in. Emily from the creative team brought Sarah lunch from her favorite Thai restaurant, a small act of kindness that showed how deeply her colleagues cared. "We can't let him win," Emily said firmly, placing the warm container on Sarah's desk. "Your presentation was brilliant, by the way. That sustainable fashion campaign idea? It's a genius." Sarah smiled at the compliment, feeling a little lighter with every passing moment. Even James, the quiet manager who rarely spoke to anyone, came by her desk to offer his support. "I've secured all the meeting recordings," he said in a low voice. "Made multiple backups too, just in case." It was clear that her colleagues were rallying behind her, standing together against the injustice of Mark's actions. Later in the afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Patricia Martinez, one of the senior board members. Patricia was known for her no-nonsense attitude and fierce advocacy for workplace equality, and her visit sent a strong signal that the company's leadership was taking the matter seriously. "Walk with me," Patricia said, not really waiting for a response. They strolled through the office park outside, the cool autumn air helping to clear Sarah's mind as Patricia spoke frankly about her own experiences. "I started here 30 years ago," Patricia said, "when women of color in corporate leadership were even rarer than they are now. What happened yesterday? We're not letting it slide." Sarah listened as Patricia shared stories of her own career battles, stories of fights for equality and fairness that had been long and hard won. The resilience in Patricia's voice was contagious, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the woman's support. What Patricia didn't mention was the emergency board meeting scheduled for the following morning, or the fact that David Johnson, the CEO, had personally called her about the situation. What Sarah didn't know was that her father had already become involved, and the incident with Mark Stevens was about to become far bigger than anyone had imagined. Back at her desk, Sarah noticed Mark Stevens walking through the office, his usual arrogance somewhat diminished. People deliberately turned away as he passed, and conversation seemed to fall silent whenever he came near. He had attempted to schedule another department meeting, but mysteriously, everyone seemed to be booked solid. It was clear that his standing in the company had already started to shift. Near the end of the day, Kevin, the intern who had supported her earlier, rushed to Sarah's desk. His face was flushed with urgency. "I just wanted to let you know," he said breathlessly, "that I've sent over all the notes I took during the meeting. They've been backed up too. I didn't want to leave anything to chance." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her as she looked at Kevin, knowing that his actions, though small, were part of a larger wave of support that was making a difference. As Sarah left the office that evening, the weight of the day's events settled in her chest. Mark Stevens might have thought his actions were insignificant, but in reality, they were the catalyst for a much-needed shift in the culture of Meridian Global Solutions. What he had set in motion would have consequences, and Sarah was ready to see them through. She could only hope that this would be the beginning of a more inclusive, fair, and just corporate environment for everyone at Meridian. Sarah had barely begun to pack up her things for the evening when Kevin, one of the interns, approached her desk with a look of barely contained excitement. His voice dropped to a whisper, though it did little to hide the enthusiasm in his tone. "You won't believe this," he said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was nearby. "I was delivering mail to the executive floor and I overheard something big is happening tomorrow." "Like really big?" His eyes were wide with anticipation, and Sarah couldn't help but smile, even as she felt a twinge of curiosity. She had a good idea of what he might be referring to. "Really?" she asked, trying to sound casual as she closed her laptop and gathered her things. She was careful not to give away the fact that she had already received a text from her father earlier that day. The message, simple but cryptic, "Dinner at home tonight," was their code for important family discussions. Her father, David Johnson, CEO of Meridian Global Solutions, didn't send messages like that without a reason, and Sarah had a feeling that the upcoming meeting would be pivotal. Kevin nodded eagerly, but before he could say more, Sarah thanked him with a smile and excused herself, making her way toward the door. She could feel her pulse quickening, a mix of excitement and uncertainty swirling inside her. She had made it through the past 2 days, weathered the storm of Mark Stevens' blatant discrimination, and now it seemed like everything was about to change. Her mind raced with possibilities, but she knew that tomorrow was going to be the turning point, not just for her but for everyone at Meridian Global Solutions. As Sarah reached the exit of the office building, she paused for a moment to glance at her reflection in the glass windows. The day's events had left their mark on her. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of carrying the responsibility of facing down injustice. But even in the tiredness there was something else, something that wasn't there a few days ago. A glimmer of anticipation, a quiet but powerful resolve. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would change everything. She left the office with her mind focused on what was to come. Her father's involvement, the HR investigation, and the increasing support from her colleagues had all pointed to one undeniable truth. Change was coming, and it wasn't just about her. It was about the culture of the entire company. Sarah wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had faced similar challenges, for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or pushed aside because of bias. And with each passing moment, that weight grew heavier, but in a way that made her feel more determined than ever before. The next morning, the sun had barely begun to rise when David Johnson, the CEO of Meridian Global Solutions, arrived at his office. Despite being in his early 60s, David still exuded an air of authority. His salt and pepper hair and impeccably tailored suit were trademarks of a man who had spent decades building his company from the ground up, and in the business world, his name was synonymous with success. But today was different. Today, David was not just the CEO. He was a father, and he was about to do something that would redefine his company's values. David sat at his desk, the light from the early morning sun spilling across the polished wood. On his computer screen, the recording of the department meeting played again. For the third time, he watched his daughter, Sarah, handle Mark Stevens' blatant racism with grace, dignity, and professionalism. With every viewing, his blood boiled more and more. Mark's dismissive attitude, his discriminatory comments about Sarah's qualifications and expertise, made David's heart ache. But what hurt even more was knowing that his daughter had faced this kind of treatment before. It was the same kind of challenge that her mother had faced years ago, and it was the same kind of challenge that David himself had spent his entire career fighting against. He had built Meridian Global Solutions with the core belief that merit should always come first, that people should be judged by their work, not their background, their gender, or their ethnicity. And Mark Stevens' behavior flew in the face of everything David had worked to create. "Sir," David's assistant Linda called from the doorway, breaking his thoughts. "Everyone's gathered in the main conference room as requested. Mr. Stevens seems quite nervous." David straightened in his chair, his hand instinctively reaching up to adjust his tie. "Good," he said quietly. "Sarah's just arrived. She's at her desk, unaware of the meeting." Linda paused, her expression hesitant. "Should I call her up too?" David shook his head. "Not yet. Let's handle the first part properly. Let's do this right." Moments later, the large conference room was packed with department heads, senior managers, and board members, all seated around the massive oak table. At the center of the room sat Mark Stevens, looking unusually out of place. His usual arrogance had been replaced with a clear sense of anxiety. His face was pale, his posture stiff. As David entered the room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. He stood tall and composed, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "Good morning," David began, his voice steady, yet filled with intent. "Yesterday, I received multiple reports about an incident that occurred in this building. Before we address it, I want to show you something." With a click of a button, the large screen at the end of the room came to life. The recording of the department meeting played in high definition, and the room was plunged into uncomfortable silence as Mark Stevens' discriminatory behavior was laid bare for everyone to see. Some of the people in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others glared at Mark, whose face was now drenched in sweat. The video played on, showing Sarah's composed response to Mark's unjust comments. She had handled herself with grace, but the tension in her posture was undeniable, and the room knew it. When the video ended, David remained standing, his hands resting firmly on the table. "I founded this company 30 years ago," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "on a simple principle: merit above all else. Every person who walks through our doors deserves to be judged by their work, their ideas, their dedication. Nothing else." His eyes locked onto Mark's, a message clear in them. "Mr. Stevens, you questioned Sarah's understanding of our market. You suggested she was here because of diversity quotas." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but David cut him off, his tone sharp. "You shouldn't need to know who someone's father is to treat them with respect. Sarah's work speaks for itself. The fact that she's my daughter doesn't make your behavior worse. It makes it exactly as unacceptable as it would be toward any employee." The room was stunned into silence, each person processing the weight of David's words. Sarah, though, sat quietly, her expression neutral as she let the moment unfold. She had known this day would come, but seeing it play out in front of her was still surreal. Jennifer Chin, Sarah's supervisor, smiled knowingly. She had suspected something when the CEO's office had called her so quickly about the incident, and now it was all becoming clear. David wasn't just reacting to one isolated incident, he was making a statement. He was setting the tone for the future of the company. "Today," David continued, his voice growing stronger, "we're not just addressing one incident. We're making fundamental changes. He handed out folders to everyone in the room, each folder containing a new set of diversity and inclusion initiatives. "Mark," David added, turning toward him, "you'll find your formal reprimand and the conditions for your continued employment if you choose to accept them." The room buzzed with energy as people opened their folders, some of them exchanging glances, others whispering under their breath. Sarah caught her father's eye across the table and gave him a subtle nod of appreciation. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about setting a new standard for the entire company. This was about creating a workplace where merit truly mattered above all else. David's voice cut through the murmur of the room. "One more thing," he added, his tone unwavering. "Starting next month, Sarah will be heading our new merit advancement program. She's earned it, just like she's earned everything else in her career." The truth was out now. Sarah wasn't just the CEO's daughter, she was a talented and respected executive in her own right, and her work spoke volumes. Mark Stevens, now fully realizing the magnitude of his actions, slumped in his chair, his confidence shattered. He knew his career at Meridian Global Solutions was hanging by a thread. But this wasn't just about his downfall. It was about rising above prejudice and creating a workplace where merit truly mattered more than anything else. The following morning, Meridian Global Solutions buzzed with activity. News of Sarah's true identity, her father's actions, and Mark Stevens' humiliation spread like wildfire through the office. David Johnson had launched a company-wide investigation into workplace culture, and today was when it truly began. Maria Torres, head of HR, had transformed the third-floor conference room into an investigation headquarters. Stacks of employee feedback forms covered the tables, and a large whiteboard displayed a timeline of reported incidents. The company was about to take a hard look at its internal culture, and the changes that would follow were set to reverberate throughout the entire organization. As Sarah entered the room, she was met with the sight of Maria Torres, the head of HR, gesturing to an empty chair. "Perfect timing," Maria said, her voice laced with both urgency and relief. "We've already received over 200 responses to the workplace culture survey. People are finally speaking up." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding as she took a seat. The room was filled with a quiet, intense energy. Everyone was gathered around large tables covered with stacks of documents, the weight of the day's revelations hanging in the air. Sarah's eyes scanned the room briefly before she picked up one of the anonymous feedback forms from the pile. She unfolded it carefully, then began to read. As she did, a deep sense of sorrow settled in her chest. The stories on the form echoed her own experiences, but they were not isolated. Other employees had faced similar forms of discrimination at the hands of their colleagues. Their managers, and worse, many of them had stayed silent out of fear. One account described how Mark Stevens, the marketing director whose actions had set everything in motion, had passed over a qualified Asian programmer, claiming she wouldn't fit the team dynamic. The words felt like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the singular actions of one man, it was the pervasive mindset that had allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. As Sarah read further, the weight of the years of systemic bias, so often hidden behind smiles and handshakes, became painfully clear. "There's more," Jennifer Chin, the senior marketing manager, said as she entered the room, carrying a thick folder. "Remember Lisa from marketing? She left last year. She just emailed me her resignation letter from back then. She specifically mentioned Mark's behavior, but, of course, it was swept under the rug by his friend in middle management." Sarah's grip tightened on the feedback form as Jennifer spoke. It was painful to hear, but it wasn't surprising. It was the story of so many talented people who had been marginalized, ignored, and pushed out. Jennifer placed the folder down on the table and opened it. Inside were additional testimonies, including emails from employees who had been overlooked, passed over, or even silenced because of their ethnicity or gender. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she realized how deeply embedded this culture of exclusion had become within the company. An hour later, David Johnson, Sarah's father and the CEO of Meridian Global Solutions, joined them in the room. His face was serious as he sat down at the table and began reviewing the growing pile of evidence. The investigation was progressing rapidly, but David knew they had just scratched the surface. "I should have done this investigation years ago," he admitted, rubbing his temples as he glanced at the documents laid out before him. "Sometimes we get so focused on business growth that we miss the rot spreading beneath the surface." Sarah looked at her father, her heart heavy with the realization that even he hadn't fully understood the scope of the problem until now. She knew the company's culture wasn't perfect, but seeing it all laid bare was still a shock to the system. Together they began working through the documentation. Incident after incident, story after story, each more shocking than the last. They were making progress, but it was clear that the task ahead of them was monumental. Just as they were delving deeper into the records, the door to the conference room burst open, and Patricia Martinez, a senior executive from legal, entered the room looking slightly frazzled. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, as though she had been rushing. "You all need to see this," she said urgently, connecting her laptop to the room's projector. On the screen behind her, a series of emails from Mark Stevens's corporate account appeared. The emails revealed a disturbing pattern. Mark had been part of an informal group of managers who called themselves the Old Guard. This group had been systematically undermining diverse candidates and employees for years, sharing inappropriate jokes, exchanging biased comments, and even coordinating their feedback to prevent certain people from advancing within the company. It was a covert network that had perpetuated the very culture of exclusion they were trying to dismantle. Sarah felt a cold wave of anger wash over her as she read through the emails. "This goes deeper than just Mark," she said quietly, the realization settling over her like a heavy weight. "It's an entire network." Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge of fury behind her words. She looked at her father, and for the first time, the full scope of the company's internal corruption seemed clear to both of them. David stood up, pacing the room as he processed the information. "Then we'll root out the entire network," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "Maria, I want a complete audit of all promotion decisions from the past 3 years. Jennifer, gather all performance reviews. Let's look for patterns. Patricia, work with legal to review our policies. We need to ensure this never happens again." The investigation began to expand quickly as more and more employees came forward with their own stories. One by one, they shared accounts of unfair treatment, bias in promotions, and the ways in which their careers had been stifled by the old guard. They had kept quiet for so long, afraid of the repercussions they might face if they spoke out. But now, as the investigation gained momentum, they found their voices. They were no longer willing to stay silent. By late afternoon, the picture had become increasingly clear. Mark Stevens wasn't an isolated case. He was merely a symptom of a much larger, more insidious problem within the company. The investigation had uncovered systematic bias not only in hiring but also in promotions, project assignments, and even day-to-day interactions. But perhaps more importantly, it had also revealed something else. A strong core of employees who had been quietly documenting the wrongdoings, supporting each other in secret, and waiting for the right moment to speak up. The moment had arrived. Just as the day was winding down, Kevin, the intern who had been quietly observing the office dynamics for months, knocked on the conference room door. He was carrying a stack of papers, his face anxious as he entered the room. I think these might help," he said nervously, setting the papers down on the table. "I've been keeping a journal of everything I've noticed since I started here, the way certain managers treat different interns, the way they dismiss people of color, the offhand comments about women in leadership positions. At first I thought I was just being paranoid, but maybe not." Sarah looked at Kevin, surprised and touched. She had no idea that he had been paying such close attention to the dynamics in the office. As they flipped through the pages of his journal, Sarah realized just how invaluable his observations were. The journal provided specific dates, times, and incidents, and helped connect the dots in ways that no one else had seen. Sometimes, the most important observations came from those who seemed to be watching from the sidelines, and Kevin's notes would prove crucial in understanding the full scope of the problem. By the time the sun was setting, it was clear that Mark Stevens was not the only issue at Meridian Global Solutions. The company's culture had been rotting from the inside out, and now the full extent of the damage was being exposed. But even in the midst of this revelation, there was hope. The evidence was now irrefutable, and the company was on the verge of a major transformation. The investigation, which had started as a response to one manager's racist outburst, had sparked a chain reaction that would change the course of the company's future. As Sarah and David prepared to wrap up the day's work, Maria handed out new documents to the team. "These are the draft proposals for structural changes," she explained. "New reporting systems, anonymous feedback channels, regular culture audits, and mandatory training programs. These are just the first steps, but they're necessary steps." The documents were full of hope, of action plans and policy changes, and a clear commitment to creating a workplace where everyone could thrive, regardless of their background. As Sarah glanced around the room, she could see the determined faces of her colleagues. They were ready for change. The sun had set outside, casting long shadows across the room, but inside the conference room, there was a sense of urgency. There was no turning back now. The door to transformation had been cracked open, and it couldn't be closed again. Meridian Global Solutions was about to undergo its biggest transformation yet, and Sarah Johnson would be at the forefront of it, not because she was the CEO's daughter, but because she had earned her place one difficult day at a time. 1 week after the investigation had begun, David Johnson called for another company-wide meeting. This time, the largest conference room at Meridian Global Solutions wasn't just full, it was overflowing. People stood along the walls, and the IT team had set up video feeds in 3 overflow rooms. The clock struck 10 a.m. as David Johnson walked in, followed by Sarah, Maria Torres, and the board of directors. Mark Stevens was sitting in the front row, his usually expensive suit now wrinkled, his confidence completely shattered. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, and it was clear to everyone that the weight of the past week had taken its toll on him. "Good morning," David began, his voice firm but controlled. "Over the past week, we've uncovered things about our company that disturbed me deeply. Not just as your CEO but as a human being." He clicked a button and the screen behind him came to life. Charts and graphs appeared, showing clear patterns of discrimination in promotions and project assignments. The numbers on the screen told a story, one of wasted potential, of talented people being pushed aside, of voices being silenced. "These numbers," David continued, his voice steady, "tell a story." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Sarah looked around, noting the various emotions that played across her colleagues' faces, shame from some, vindication from others, and determination from many. It was a room divided, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind that things were about to change. David turned to Mark Stevens, who was sitting uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Stevens, would you care to explain this?" he asked, his voice cold. The email chain from the old guard group appeared on the screen, exposing their discriminatory actions for all to see. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Mark stood up shakily, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "Mr. Johnson, I can explain," he stammered. "Please do," David interrupted, his gaze unflinching. "Explain why you and your colleagues thought it was acceptable to mock employees' accents in private messages. Explain why you labeled certain resumes as culture risks based on their names. Explain why you felt threatened by my daughter's success, even before you knew she was my daughter." Mark's face turned bright red, his eyes flickering nervously around the room. "It was just workplace banter," he said, his voice trembling. "We were maintaining professional standards. You can't blame us for wanting to protect the company." But the damage was done. The truth had come to light, and Mark's feeble explanations couldn't change the fact that his actions, and those of his colleagues, had created an environment of exclusion, fear, and silence. Now the company had no choice but to face the consequences. The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with tension as Sarah stood up, her voice firm and resolute. The entire room was focused on her, watching as she made her way to the front. Mark Stevens, the once powerful and arrogant manager, sat quietly, his posture slouched. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Today was different. Sarah wasn't just speaking up for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had been silenced, marginalized, or dismissed. As she addressed Mark, her words carried an undeniable strength. "Let me tell you about protection, Mr. Stevens," Sarah began, her gaze unwavering. "Last year, Lisa from marketing protected herself by quitting rather than face the daily harassment. Kevin, the intern, protected himself by documenting every discriminatory comment he heard. Emily from creative protected herself by taking screenshots of every inappropriate message she received." Sarah paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in the room before continuing. "But true protection isn't about hiding from problems. It's about confronting them. It's about making changes and ensuring everyone has a fair chance to succeed. That's the kind of protection we need here." David, Sarah's father and the CEO, nodded approvingly from his seat. His face was filled with pride as he glanced at his daughter, who had risen to the occasion in a way he had never expected. Then he turned back to the room. "Today we are announcing major changes." David clicked to the next slide in the presentation. It was a pivotal moment, one that would reshape the future of Meridian Global Solutions. "First," he continued, "the entire Old Guard management team will be required to attend comprehensive sensitivity and inclusion training. Those who refuse will be asked to resign. We're not tolerating ignorance or resistance to change anymore." A murmur rippled through the room as employees absorbed the weight of David's words. The Old Guard, a group of managers who had held power and influence in the company for years, had perpetuated an environment of exclusion. But now their time was up. "We are also implementing new hiring and promotion protocols," David said, clicking to the next slide. There will be diverse panels making the decisions, ensuring a fair and equitable process. We're creating an anonymous reporting system, and we will be establishing a review board to examine past complaints that were ignored. The room was silent, the gravity of the moment settling in. Mark Stevens, unable to sit quietly any longer, stood up angrily. This is ridiculous. You can't just change everything because of one incident, he shouted, his face flushed with indignation. One incident? Patricia Martinez's voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. Patricia, a member of the board, stood up with an air of authority that commanded attention. I have here 17 documented complaints against you personally, Mr. Stevens, she said coldly. Complaints that your friends and management conveniently buried. Should I read them aloud? The room fell silent. Mark's face turned pale as he sank back into his chair. He had no words left. His defenses had crumbled under the weight of the evidence. This wasn't just about a single incident, it was about a systemic issue that had festered for years. David took a step forward, his voice calm but unwavering. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about growth. It's about change. It's about building a better company. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on those who were still uncomfortable with the changes being introduced. Some of you may not like these changes. You may find them uncomfortable or unnecessary. But I'll say this. Meridian Global Solutions will no longer be a comfortable place for discrimination. If that bothers you, there's the door. Sarah watched as a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but many others sat up straighter, their eyes bright with hope and determination. The future of the company was being redefined in this very room, and Sarah knew that they were on the right path. David continued, his voice filled with resolve. Starting today, Sarah Johnson will lead our new workplace culture and merit advancement division. Not because she's my daughter, he clarified, her identity was kept secret during the selection process. She earned this role through her demonstrated leadership, insight, and commitment to fairness. The announcement was met with a mix of surprise and admiration from the room. Sarah had proven herself time and again, and now she would be at the helm of the company's cultural transformation. As the meeting concluded, employees filed out, their conversations a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Mark Stevens remained seated, staring at the ground. His world had completely transformed and he knew it. Sarah caught her father's eye from across the room and smiled. This confrontation, she realized, wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something far bigger than herself. The real work of transforming Meridian Global Solutions was just starting, and she was ready for the challenge. 2 weeks later, the transformation was already underway. The 15th floor, once home to executive offices, had been completely repurposed into the new workplace culture and merit center. Sarah sat in her new office, reviewing progress reports spread across her desk. The buzz of activity in the building was palpable. Teams were working together in ways they never had before, and the change was visible in every corner of the office. Mark Stevens, now demoted to a junior analyst, stood outside her door waiting for their scheduled meeting. His designer suit was gone, replaced by business casual attire that matched his new position. The demotion had been a bitter pill to swallow, but he knew it was this or resignation. He had no choice. Come in, Mr. Stevens, Sarah called, her voice professional and neutral. Mark entered the office and she noticed how different he looked. Humbled, perhaps even a little ashamed. She gestured for him to sit down. Let's review your first 2 weeks of sensitivity training, she said as she opened his progress folder. Mark pulled out his folder with trembling hands. I've completed all the assigned modules, he said quietly. And I've been working with Dr. Rodriguez, the diversity consultant. Sarah opened her own copy of the progress report. Dr. Rodriguez's notes were detailed, outlining Mark's initial resistance to the training, but also his growing understanding. Mr. Stevens shows a particularly deep impact from the role reversal exercises and personal stories shared by colleagues, the notes read. Sarah looked up from the report and met his eyes. Tell me what you've learned, she asked. Mark hesitated for a moment. I never thought about how it felt on the other side, he said quietly. In training they had us listen to recordings of our own comments played back to us. It was uncomfortable. I hurt myself, really hurt myself for the first time. Sarah nodded, remembering how Dr. Rodriguez had described these breakthrough moments. She encouraged him to continue. Yesterday Lisa, the marketing manager who quit last year, came back as a guest speaker in our training. Mark's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. She described how her children would ask her why she was crying after work. I have kids too. The thought of someone making my daughters feel that way. He trailed off, clearly moved. I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I am sorry. And I want to do better. Sarah pulled out another document from her desk. Your team has provided feedback on your progress, she said, reading from the report. Kevin, who you once dismissed as just an intern, says you've started actually reading his project proposals. Emily notes that you've stopped interrupting women in meetings. These are small steps, but they're important ones. Outside the office, the new Merit Center was buzzing with activity. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see diverse teams working together, attending workshops, and engaging in honest discussions about workplace culture. The change was palpable, tangible. Mr. Stevens, Sarah continued, you're not the only one learning. Our entire company is learning. Yesterday we had 5 former employees contact us about returning. They saw our changes on LinkedIn and want to be part of the transformation. She stood up and walked to the window, gazing out over the city. Do you know why we didn't fire you, Mr. Stevens? Why we offered you this chance at redemption? She asked. Mark shook his head, unable to speak. Because true change isn't just about punishing wrong behavior, Sarah said. It's about transforming it. You've held significant influence in this company. Now, you can use that experience to influence positive change instead. Sarah turned back to her desk, pulling out a new document. Starting next month, as part of your rehabilitation program, you'll be sharing your story with other companies. You'll talk about what you've learned here. You'll tell them how this company is transforming and how they can do the same. Mark Stevens sat silently, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. His journey had only just begun, but for the first time in a long time, he saw a glimmer of hope for redemption. And that hope was rooted in the possibility of change, real, lasting change. 6 months had passed since the fateful day when Mark Stevens made his discriminatory comments, setting off a chain of events that would reshape the culture at Meridian Global Solutions. The building from the outside looked the same, sleek, modern, a symbol of corporate success. But inside, everything had changed. The air felt lighter, more open, filled with energy and optimism. Employees walked with purpose, and the buzz of new ideas and discussions could be heard in every corner of the building. At the center of this transformation stood Sarah Johnson, who had emerged as a leader, not only within her company but across the corporate world. Now, Sarah was standing at the podium of the National Business Leadership Conference, facing an audience of over 1,000 corporate leaders from across the country. The spotlight shone on her, illuminating the quiet confidence she had developed over the past few months. The story she was about to share was one of profound change. A story not just about a company's transformation, but about the power of accountability, growth, and opportunity. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, I was a marketing executive facing discrimination in my workplace. Today, I stand before you not just as the head of our merit advancement program, but as living proof that change is possible. The room grew silent as her words sank in. The audience knew they were about to hear something powerful. As Sarah spoke, her eyes scanned the audience. She saw her father, David Johnson, sitting proudly in the front row, his face a mix of pride and reflection. Behind him were Jennifer Chin, Maria Torres, and even Mark Stevens. Mark was now a changed man. No longer the arrogant, dismissive manager he had been 6 months ago. His presence on stage with Sarah was a testament to the success of the company's transformation, and the audience felt the weight of that. Our company's story went viral, Sarah continued, clicking to show a slide of headlines that covered the success of their reform program. But this isn't just about one racist manager or one brave employee. It's about creating lasting change in corporate America. She paused, letting that statement resonate. This is about reshaping the very culture of how we work together, how we treat each other, and how we build inclusive, supportive environments. The statistics she shared next were staggering, proof that change was not only possible but also profitable. Employee satisfaction is up by 60%. Productivity has increased by 45%. Diversity in leadership positions has doubled. And our company's revenue has grown by 35% since we implemented new inclusive policies. As Sarah rattled off these numbers, several CEOs in the audience sat up straighter, clearly impressed. But Sarah wasn't just interested in the numbers. She understood that data alone could never tell the whole story. This is not just about what we've accomplished on paper, she said, her eyes scanning the room. It's about the people, the lives that have been changed, the relationships that have been rebuilt. It's about fostering an environment where everyone has a chance to succeed. With a purposeful motion, Sarah clicked to another slide that showed images of their team working together, collaborating across departments, and engaging in meaningful conversations about their shared values. Then, with a slight smile, she added, And I'm not just talking about the employees here at Meridian Global Solutions. I'm talking about the impact we've had beyond our walls. She clicked through another slide, revealing a new initiative, a partnership with 50 other major companies to share resources, training programs, and success stories in creating inclusive workplaces. The corporate reform network was gaining momentum, and Sarah knew it was only the beginning. They were not just transforming their own company but were now setting the stage for a larger movement within corporate America. But the real transformation, Sarah said, comes when we confront our own biases, when we look at ourselves in the mirror and ask hard questions. That's why I'd like to invite someone to the stage who has experienced this transformation firsthand. She gestured to the side of the stage where Mark Stevens stood, no longer the arrogant figure he once was. Mark walked onto the stage, his steps measured and humble. He stood at the second podium, facing the audience with an air of quiet dignity. "My name is Mark Stevens," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "6 months ago, I was the villain in this story. Today, I'm here to tell you about my journey, from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution." His words struck a chord with the audience as they listened intently to his testimony. Mark described his initial resistance to change, his discomfort with the training, and his deep-seated prejudices that had once clouded his judgment. But he also spoke about the self-reflection, the hard conversations, and the difficult work he had done to change his beliefs and actions. He shared stories of the employees he had hurt, the people he had dismissed, and how those relationships were now in the process of being repaired. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "But I realized that if I wanted to be part of the solution, I had to take responsibility for my actions. I had to own my mistakes." As Mark spoke, several people in the audience wiped away tears, moved by his raw honesty and vulnerability. When Mark finished, Sarah returned to the podium, her voice resolute. "Change isn't just about policies and procedures," she said. "It's about creating a culture where everyone can thrive. At Meridian, we've implemented what we call the Merit Matters program." She clicked through slides showing the new initiatives they had put in place, including blind resume screening, diverse interview panels, mentorship programs, and regular cultural competency training. As Sarah explained the practical steps they had taken to create a more inclusive workplace, the audience scribbled furiously in their notebooks, eager to implement similar changes in their own companies. Sarah's pride in their accomplishments was clear, but she also understood that the true measure of success was in the impact on the people, the employees who now had an equal opportunity to succeed. "But our proudest achievement," Sarah said with a smile, "is our corporate reform network." She revealed that their latest project involved a partnership with 50 other major companies to share resources, offer training programs, and exchange success stories on how to create inclusive workplaces. The response from the audience was immediate. Many of the CEOs were already pulling out their phones, eager to schedule meetings with Sarah and her team to discuss how they could join the network. As Sarah concluded her speech, she shared a personal story. "My father, our CEO, once told me that real respect is earned, not given," she said, her eyes glancing toward her father in the front row. "That's why I started at the bottom of our company, using my mother's maiden name. What I learned is that respect isn't just about individual achievement. It's about creating an environment where everyone has a fair chance to earn it." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that her words had resonated so powerfully. The applause continued as people stood in a standing ovation, recognizing not just Sarah's achievements, but the incredible transformation she had led. As Sarah stepped off the stage, Lisa, the employee who had quit and later returned, rushed up to her with exciting news. "Our story just got picked up by a major news network," Lisa said, grinning. "And companies across the globe are reaching out to learn from what we've done." During the reception, Sarah found herself surrounded by business leaders eager to implement similar changes in their own companies. Mark Stevens stood nearby, speaking with a group of managers about the importance of confronting their own biases and the transformative power of accountability. Sarah smiled, watching the room full of influential people discussing real, meaningful change. David Johnson, her father, joined her at the refreshment table. "You've started something remarkable," he said, his pride evident in his voice. "This is bigger than Meridian now." Sarah smiled back, watching the room with a sense of fulfillment. "Sometimes," she replied, "it takes one moment of darkness to help us see the light. What happened 6 months ago was terrible, but look at the change it sparked." As the evening wound down, Sarah stood by the windows of the conference center, gazing out at the city skyline. In offices across those buildings, there were people facing the same challenges she had faced just a few months ago. But now, thanks to their story and their example, change was coming. Real, lasting change that would open doors for countless others walking the same path she had walked. The incident with the racist manager had become more than just a story of personal triumph. It had become a catalyst for transformation across corporate America. And Sarah knew this was just the beginning.